Hello, I'm Hollis Turnbow and I'm going to talk to you about quilting. This series that I'll be doing is all about quilting. Thinking about a title and the direction that we might go, I remembered those last three words that you find in a lot of quilt books or patterns, in which they give very specific instructions how to make the quilt, but then the last three words are quilt as desired. That's what we're going to do from start to finish, with a great deal of emphasis on the quilting design, because after all, it isn't a quilt until it's quilted. So stay tuned, stay with us to learn all about quilt as desired. Welcome back. I'm excited to start this journey with you about quilt making as I know it, and as I've said earlier, quilt as desired. But before I get into that particular part of it, I want to walk through you the quilting styles, or the styles of the quilting patterns that we recognize and that we do. Because in reading the internet and talking to new quilters, I realize that there's a whole body of knowledge, perhaps, that for one reason or the other that they've missed. When I started quilting back in the early 70s, of course, we were just absolutely pushed full of all kinds of very basic information about quilt making. We did sampler quilts that included every style you could conceivably know or have any desire or any knowledge about in quilt making, including those that we would never touch again after we did the initial sample. But I think it's important that we think about those styles, especially in relation to the next decision is, how will I quilt it? And that's going to be the subject of this entire series. While there'll be a lot of techniques discussed and a lot of samples shown, the ultimate goal is that final piece of the quilt making process, and that's how will it be quilted. So that's what we're going to be doing. So what I want to do first is to go through a whole series just as kind of a background to get us started. And then second, I want to talk about that decision making that you'll go through and how will I really quilt it. Because I do strongly believe that as we're doing patchwork or as we're doing applique, there's one little thing that should be going through our minds is, how will I quilt it? Because you might need to make a lot of decisions or change decisions along the way to reach that final goal. So I want to go through some of these things first. Patchwork. Patchwork is just simply cutting and sewing small sections of fabric together to create some kind of a design or create a whole. Here's a basket made basically out of triangles and squares. Here's another one, a very traditional pattern here. Again, a little bit more complicated in its process. But one thing I want to say through all of this is, while there are a lot of decisions that need to be made in the overall process of quilt making, there are really three very basic concepts that we should always keep in mind. I certainly hate to use the word rules, but in this case I am going to use the word rules. Accurate marking, accurate measuring, accurate cutting, and accurate piecing. Once you've mastered those three things, then the sky's the limit. You can do most anything. And I believe that most people, most quilt makers, when they have difficulty along the process, it can all be tracked back to those three things. Something in the marking or the measuring or the cutting or the piecing was not quite right, which means then that the domino effect down the line makes a lot of the process frustrating and difficult. So patchwork, good accurate seams, good cutting, measuring of pieces to assure the accuracy. Here's another piece, the same pattern. however done in a little bit different colors. So again, color is your choice. Here's a quilt block that contains both patchwork and applique. You see the patchwork here in the triangle basket, and then the basket top or handle would be appliqued. This pattern is interesting in that this is the same one that was used in 1978 when the Postal Service issued a stamp commemorating quilting as folk art. I was involved with that process, and later on in the show I will have a reproduction of that quilt that was done. Here's another pattern that contains both patchwork and applique. A good way to do difficult curved lines rather than piece those in. And then the same pattern here, again in a different color arrangement, almost a positive and negative. So these are different techniques that you can use in creating the same look in the block. And then a very traditional 16 patch, 4 squares one way, 4 squares the other way. But on this one, I've quilted in each individual section. Just a very simple quilting pattern that gives dimension and effect to it. And we'll be talking more about those decisions a little bit later on. Now, the second major type of quilting that we find is applique. Here's an example of a small piece that I have just simply started. I drew the design on muslin first and then just put one small piece so that you could see the progression. And here's the full applique of the basket. Applique is a technique of cutting out squares or cutting out designs and applying it to the background fabric. So it's a dimensional style. Applique coming from the French word meaning to lay on. So this is either machine stitched down the edges or hand done. And then a very distinctive style in applique is what is referred to as Hawaiian applique. Started with, it is said, with the missionaries who went to Hawaii back in the 1800s. Usually one large piece of fabric stitched down and then quilted in a very distinctive way in an echo style around that. So another style, usually these types of quilts contain just one large major focus block in the center of the quilt with other motifs around, but just straight quilting, not really decorative quilting around them. Then another style of quilting, which is popular in some parts of the country, and certainly with hand quilters, is what we call white on white, or white work quilting. And that's when you just use the quilting design as the focal point, or as the design. Usually done on solid color fabric. The distinction about this is it's done on one piece of fabric, or pieces of fabric that's sewn together to appear to be one piece of fabric. So here's an example of white on white. I happen to have a small crib quilt that was also done in the same technique. Very, very distinctive, really quite elegant, but very simple. Crib quilt might have been a christening quilt at the time. But what these styles of quilt making did is shows out the artistry of the quilt maker and the skill. This one is really quite good in that it's being lined up quite perfectly. All the diamonds seem to be even and perfect. So this is a very good example of the style. Then to get into the more exotic types of quilt making, we have something called Trapunto, which is an Italian style. It's dimensional quilt in that you sew channels in the fabric and then you pull thread or yarn through that to give a dimensional effect, and you put stuffing in to give a dimensional effect. Not too popular in our country, but certainly had its glory in Europe at certain times. Another small example of that, which is a combination of just simply stitching white work, and I started stuffing a little bit to give some dimension. Then one style that's distinctively American is what we call Victorian crazy patch. And this was popular late 1800s up to about 1910, 1912. And that was taking all kinds of fabric, putting it together, laying it over each other, and then add decorative quilting or decorative stitches to it. And I have here on the front an original, usually made out of fine satin fabric. Ribbons were added, embroidery was added. These were very popular to just throw over the couch as a direct decorative piece. A lot of times they were made from salesman's samples fabric and dressmaking fabric. You can see the elegance of this, velvet, satin, taffeta. So that's another style which really never attained much popularity. And then, of course, something that's happened quite frequently or currently is something called a rag quilt. Very popular with quilt makers because it was easy. You put layers of a fabric together that frays very well, sew them together. Once you get them sewed, then the total quilt is finished. So rag quilt. But then quilt making can be done in any type of form. You don't have to have perfect geometric shapes. You can make your own shapes. And as long as you're very accurate and very precise in that, you can sew any kind of shape together. And then the quilting adds a little bit of decorativeness to it. Another style that was very popular during the Depression years of the 1930s was called string quilts. And the quilt maker would use all those extra pieces that were left from sides of dressmaking or shirt making to sew them together in new blocks. And that's what you see in this one. Start with a center square, add strips around it to create a larger piece of fabric, and then sew them together. It's interesting that within the last year, styles of quilt making like this is becoming popular again. And I think it's because of the increase in prices of our fabric. We have a stash of fabric in the closet, not enough to make a large quilt, but certainly you can sew them together, make new fabric, cut that out, make new quilts with it. And also a lot of charity work being done with quilts of this style. So this walks you through the styles of quilt making. I hope that I've covered this. I've given you a little bit of inspiration and you've seen an idea that you might pick up and do. Lots of information on the internet. There are all kinds of tutorials out there that you can go for any specific style that you might be looking for. So with this as a background, when I come back, I'll talk about then that next decision that you may need to make, and that's how do you quilt it? What decisions do I make when I'm selecting the quilting designs? What problems might I have? Just that next process in it. All part of our journey on those three words, quilt as you go. Or, as I should say, quilt as desired. Welcome back. I hope you didn't go far, but while you were going, I hope that you were thinking a lot about what we talked about earlier about those quilting styles, because now we'll go into the next phase, is how should I quilt it? Or what should I be thinking about when it's quilted? Because there's a book that was published several years ago called It Isn't a Quilt Until It's Quilted. And that means you've got to hook it together, those three layers together in some way. And that can be a number of ways, and that choice will certainly be yours to do. So I want to talk now about those decisions that you might make. Because if you remember earlier, I said that while you're doing the patchwork, while you're doing the applique, I really believe that it's helpful if in your mind you're thinking about how will I quilt it? Because there are a lot of decisions that you may need to make. For instance, a decision in which direction might I press the seams? Because if you plan to quilt in the ditch and you press all of your seams open, you have no ditch to quilt in. So you have to think about these things. Do you want to quilt it simply? Does it really require a lot of decorative quilting? Or does the fabric itself create the design, and the fabric is the focal point there. They can be simple. Very simple crib quilt that I do very often for charity work is just simply a piece of fabric sandwiched together, quilted about every 4.5 inches. It's the purpose here that I'm dealing with. It's a quilt that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but yet I want to make a quality product. So I make these, I put the binding on, then I sit at night watching television while I'm doing the hand stitching on the binding. So again, the purpose is one that it's not going to require a lot of decorative stitching, because this is something that's going to be lovingly abused by a child somewhere. And so I want to make a sturdy quilt that they can use simply for that. There's some patterns then that really don't call for decorativeness. Here's one that's very simple, bar type quilt, has the strips in between. Now I could have put a quilting design in here, but I really didn't think it needed it. It just needs quilting in the ditch here to hold it all together. The other interesting thing about this quilt is this was a series of samples that one of the fabric companies gave me. They were all cut exactly this way. So I'm really becoming interested in being the frugal quilter. So these were on the table, and I kept looking at them, and I said, there's enough there that I can do just a bar quilt and then put it together with these strips. So again, it didn't need it. It's quilted sufficiently that I didn't need decorative quilting in here. Very easy quilt to put together. Even out in the borders, I quilted 1 inch out here. Good sturdy. One thing I might say about quilting is that your batting companies will give an indication on their packaging about how far apart you're quilting, and the batting will still stay stable. That's a good thing to follow and to look at, because at least you'll know the parameters that you're working in. But yet, does it really need to be quilted that far apart? Does it need to be quilted closer? Those are the decisions that you make after those first rules I gave you earlier about the accuracy of your patchwork. This is the part that's strictly up to you. Another very interesting pattern called Peekaboo, which is a dimensional quilt. I don't know where I would quilt this one, because you have all of this dimensional work in here. So I simply quilted in the ditch, just enough to stabilize it and hold it together. And again, because this is the focal point, I didn't think that the border needed any kind of decorative quilting in it. So those were the decisions I made there. You can quilt by hand, quilt by machine, or the other technique that was very popular was simply tying the quilt. And that's rather than quilt it with stitches, you would come periodically and use embroidery floss or some other kind of a larger thread, thicker thread, to tie the 3 layers together. A very easy technique was used for utility quilts, a quilt that was needed to be made very quickly. I have one at home that I was looking at the other day that obviously has another quilt inside. It's an older quilt, probably early 1900s, and instead of regular batting, it has another quilt inside, and it's tied. So it was an easy way. It's all part of that being the frugal quilter. Now I want to go to the other table and to show you some examples of quilting as the old-timers did, and kind of give you some background into the type of quilting that they did. These quilts on this table, the first 2 were made first one was by my grandmother, and then the second one by aunts. They were prolific quilters, and that's really where I got my first introduction to quilt making, because in the wintertime there was a quilt that hung from the ceiling on a large frame and hung from the ceiling with a rope, and I would play under the quilt and I would watch them. So that was my introduction to quilt making, other than to sleep under a quilt at night. The traditional quilting technique that they used was what they called the fan pattern, or shells. It comes a number of names, but it's an old traditional pattern, and it was used primarily for the utility quilts. And utility quilts were those that were used every day. You know, they were not decorative quilts. Quilt makers always had a group in the closet that were the fancy quilts, and they would get them out when company came to show the quality and the workmanship of their particular quilt making skill. But the utility quilting in shells was traditionally done. It was a quick way to quilt. The first one was done that way. The second one that was done by my aunts, same way. You can't see it on the back, but certainly here on the front you can see the shells. Later on in the programs, I'll be talking and giving more detail and demonstrate actually how the old-timers did it and those tools and equipment that we have today to make it much easier. Because it is becoming more popular. It's an easy method, it's an easy technique, and a great machine quilting technique to do this particular pattern. Another quilt is very interesting. In 1978, the U.S. Postal Service issued a postage stamp commemorating quilt making as a folk art. And I was privileged to be part of that activity because I lived in West Virginia at the time and worked with the Department of Culture and History to curate a quilt show in Charleston. And the 30th anniversary, which was in 2008, we reproduced the quilt. Used fabrics that were reproduction fabrics dating to mid-1850s. The interesting thing about this is it has minimal quilting. And this again is a decision that you will want to make. Does it need any kind of decorative quilting on it, or does it just need quilting to fix the three layers together? In the center, it's quilted 1/4 of an inch out, as you can see in these blocks, which gives a little bit of definition. The border, however, did have a diagonal quilting in it, which adds some decorative to it. White background, so it certainly needs something to give it some dimensional effect here. So this is an exact reproduction of that quilt. Then another one, which I enjoyed, and I do like this one, and it had some very special consideration when I quilted it or while I was making it. This was designed from a Navajo Indian rug using the traditional Navajo techniques. And when I was thinking about the quilting, I thought about the dimensional effect that the woven rug would have. And so it was quilted horizontally every 1/2 inch. And when it's hanging at a distance, it does look like that woven rug and has a great dimensional effect to it. The colors are traditional Navajo hand-dyed fabric looks. Now I want to go back to the other table because there's some other factors and other considerations and examples that I want to give you there. Remember I said earlier that quilting in the ditch, and when you're piecing it, the directions that you iron your seams will determine how you'll be quilted. Here's a good example that really backfired on me. I made this quilt. The request was for pink. The circumstances that I was going to give it away were that I didn't want to spend a great deal of time with it and not do any decorative quilting on it. You can see here, since I've had it for 2 years, the intended person is probably not going to get it. Well, they didn't know they were going to get it in the first place, so I'm probably okay. But all the time I was piecing these blocks, I was thinking, well, I'll just quilt in the ditch because that will be easier. However, when I was making it, I pressed all the seams open, so I had no ditch to quilt in. So now I've got to decide how I am going to quilt it sufficiently to give it the dimension that I want. And I'll talk about that specifically in a separate episode. 2 other examples. Again, a very simple patchwork geometric quilt. Doesn't need much. I didn't want to put much in it. So quilted 1/4 of an inch out from the edge. And that gives it dimension because I could have put a decorative design here. I could put a lot of stuff over here. but it's sufficient the way it is. And then another example here, a design that I did, which I call Morning Star, because of the ray of light that comes out. Didn't need any quilting. It just needed quilting to reinforce the design or the shape of the pieces that was here. So again, don't get really obsessed about the fact that you might need to make a lot of very highly fancy quilting on it, because it might not really need there. Think about the purpose of the quilt. Here's one that I'm really have had a dilemma about, and I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do. Another very simple design. I looked at this. I saw large areas here that could accommodate a quilting design, but yet this is not the focal point. The focal point is this star right here. So I felt if I put feathers or whatever here, the eye would be drawn somewhere it shouldn't be. So I have an idea this one will just be quilted maybe 1/4 of an inch out or in the ditch in something very simple, because this is what I want to show, the star. Don't let anybody ever tell you that there's nothing original left in the world, because this one I believe truly is, and I was doodling one night. And I have never seen this particular star done in any pattern or any book. And it's simply made out of squares and half-square triangles. So very simply. Same thing is true with Morning Star. I was doodling one day. But the distinctive thing about this is these diamonds are not perfect. They're a little bit sideways, and that's what gives the effect. And then the use of the fabric here gives the ray effect in it. So there's still some originality left in the world, and you can be creative. Sometimes it happens by accident. Sometimes it becomes deliberate. Another example is this Amish-looking quilt. Didn't need a lot of decorative quilting in it because it's the fabric that gives the impression or gives the design, is the fabric. I have this quilt. It's a sampler quilt, has a lot of different designs in it, has a lot of open space here that you can see. Confusing when you're thinking about how it would be quilted. What is the focal point? The blocks, what I find in the solid space, whatever it is. Stay tuned. We're going to be talking about that as the series progresses. And I hope that we have a solution at the end, or at least an idea about the way that we might go. I'm Hollis Turnbow. Hope to see you in the next episode as we step deeper and deeper into those 3 words, quilt as desired.